I was never the kind of person who believed in plot twists. I liked routines. Double shift on Tuesdays, black coffee at 3 a.m., a rent-stained couch that had memorized my shape. My name is Evelyn Mercer, and for the last 2 years I was the night nurse for Augustus Langley, a man whose name filled the corner offices of the city, even if his breath came shallow and slow in a hospital bed. He was 80, brittle as old paper, and spent his days tucked into cashmere and regrets while the family polished their smiles for photo ops. I cleaned his spills, held a hand that trembled with memory, and learned the cadence of a man who had once been terrifyingly powerful and was now, in a way I almost loved, utterly human. People assume caretakers are invisible, background characters who fade when the curtain falls. That wasn't my life. It was my paycheck. I had no stake in Langley Enterprises, no velvet tastes, no dinner invitations. I had a small apartment, an emergency savings account I could count to the dollar, and a stubborn refusal to be ashamed of where I came from. The Langleys treated me kindly enough, polite distance, the kind of gratitude that buys vacations and keeps names out of headlines. Helena Langley, the widow, had a voice that could make a committee tremble. Elliot Langley, their son, wore suits like armor. Vivian Langley, their daughter, favored perfumes that announced her before she entered a room. They expected dignity at the bedside, and they expected to inherit the dignity of the man they'd married and the empire he'd built. So when the attorney asked the room to quiet for Augustus's will reading, I thought it would be the usual choreography: condolences, the rustle of documents, murmured acceptance of the inevitable. I sat front row because I'd been named in a brief note for Evelyn with thanks, and because honesty kept me close to what had mattered to me. The Langleys took their places on the stage of entitlement, faces already arranged for victory. The air smelled faintly of lilies and legal paper. Then the lawyer said my name, and the world did that slow, disorienting double take, where everything familiar shifts an inch and refuses to line up again. Augustus left almost everything to me. Not a token sum, not a sentimental trinket. The controlling stake in Langley Enterprises, the houses, the trusts, the eyebrow-raising, monopoly-building heart of everything the family had believed was theirs by right. The room rearranged itself around that fact. Helena's color went from blush to a hard, calculated white. Elliot's jaw tightened like a trap. Vivian's perfume closed off like a drawn curtain. I remember my own pulse, loud as a fist against my throat, and a ridiculous, childish hope that maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe the paper had been the wrong file. Maybe I'd misheard. But the pages were real, and the lawyer's voice was steady, and Augustus's signature looked exactly like the man I'd watched sleep through the last of his grudges. What was at stake wasn't just money. It was a lifetime of power, a boardroom that could be moved by the tilt of one finger, and a family's ability to erase and rewrite the past. For me, an exhausted nurse with easier dreams than revenge, it was a doorway to a life no one had built for me, and the world's sharp attention turned all at once to the person it had expected to be invisible. They didn't take velvet gloves to the room. They brought brass knuckles disguised as sympathy. The Langleys erupted like a simmering pot someone had finally nudged too hard. Helena's voice turned into something sharp enough to carve marble. Elliot paced like a man rehearsing his outrage in front of a mirror. Vivian gathered the family's outrage into a perfume-scented missile and launched it straight at me. "There's been a mistake," Helena said, but it was an accusation dressed up as a plea. "This is fraud, manipulation. He wasn't lucid the last months. How could he possibly?" "You're a nurse," Elliot said, each word clipped. "You had access. You had motive." They circled their sentences like sharks. It wasn't even subtle. It was a class performance. Perfectly timed outrage with lawyers waiting off stage. A cousin I'd only met at the funeral demanded my phone records as if I were a celebrity caught on a sting operation. Someone muttered, "Gold digger," loud enough for a few cameras on the edge of the room to swivel. I learned quick how people who have spent a life believing in their own rulebooks react when someone else takes the pen. Their faces hardened into titles. Entitled, furious, predatory. They said things meant to make me small. They were trying to make the air itself accuse me. When the first lawyer arrived for them, a gray-suited man with a practiced scowl. I expected the predictable threat letters, the promise of litigation, the way those storms usually started. A press release here, an injunction there. What I didn't expect was Mr. Calder. Mr. Calder walked in like a man who'd handled awkward inheritances for half a lifetime and disliked melodrama. He arranged his papers, clicked his pen once, and smiled like someone about to explain how gravity works. He knew exactly what they wanted to throw at me, and he had already built the umbrella. Augustus anticipated objection, Mr. Calder said, not raising his voice. He went to lengths most people think sentimental. He requested psychiatric evaluations when he was still hale. Those evaluations confirm competency. He recorded a statement explaining his decisions. He slid a bundle of documents across the table with a soft authority that made them look like evidence in an art heist rather than in a family fight. The evaluations were detailed, clinical, and boring in the way that makes fraud hard to fake. Dates, signatures, the stamp of an institutional mind, not easily swayed by opportunistic claims. Then, because lawyers know their theater, he produced a small device, something like a digital voice recorder, and clicked play. Augustus's voice filled the room, low and wry, with the same cadence I'd memorized over late-night shifts. He spoke about fairness, about promises kept and debts he could not erase in his lifetime. He said my name like someone offering a benediction and explained, in his own blunt way, why the empire had to be put into hands he trusted to remember what built it. For a few minutes, the room became a strange kind of silence. The Langleys' outrage shivered, then reformed into legal fury, softer in the voice, harder in intent. They would contest it, of course. They had resources and reflex. Threats of court and forensics, of humiliating depositions, of ugly headlines. They marshaled their lawyers and left with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The city would have a narrative in 48 hours, and I would be the main character in someone else's version of events. I went home that night the way I always did after the world had been rearranged, chewing a frozen pizza with one hand, reading the will again with the other, testing the edges of disbelief like a seamstress checks a hem. The kitchen light hummed like a distant generator. I felt the music of the house settle around me, an odd hush after the storm. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Augustus's personal things, but I had keys to his room for my shifts, and sometimes grief is practical. You close drawers for the living because the dead are not good at it. There, tucked into the lining of his dressing gown, the one he always insisted smelled of bergamot and the rain on his old estate, was an envelope addressed to me in slanted exact handwriting. The envelope was thick, the seal a smudge of wax I recognized from the countless packages I'd watched him sign and seal with small pomp. Under the flap lay a letter and a small brass key, dull and warm like it had just been pressed. The handwriting on the letter was Augustus's, precise, impatient with sentiment, but somehow kind. The key was tiny but heavy, the sort of thing meant for a safe or a small cabinet rather than anything ornamental. A single line at the top of the letter made my throat close. If you're reading this, Evelyn, then I did the one thing I could not do in life: make my own reckoning. I held the key between my fingers like an accusation and a promise, both. The rest of the letter waited on my lap like a loaded rope. I read the first sentence and felt the world rearrange itself again, but this time in a way that felt deliberate, like the quiet click of a lock opening. The envelope smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old paper. I sat at my kitchen table while the city hummed somewhere above my ceiling and read Augustus's handwriting like it was a map to a country I'd never been allowed to visit. He started slow, with the kind of preface you give before you admit something that will make people angry. He wrote about debts and promises, about being young once and terrible at keeping secrets. Then he named my father, Samuel Mercer. He called him Sam, like they'd been conspirators in some smaller, kinder life. The letter said that Sam had been Augustus's partner early on, the quiet, furious brain behind the machinery that later bore the Langley name on its storefronts and its annual reports. Sam had designed the first product, deciphered the patent language nobody else could translate, stayed up nights with grease under his nails, and a kind of stubborn moral code that made him dangerous to a particular kind of person. I read the part about the fall 3 times before my hands stopped shaking. According to Augustus, the Langley family, Helena, Elliot, Vivian, had been waiting at the edge of Sam's brilliance like vultures, patient and practiced. When Sam began to ask awkward questions about revenue, about who owned what, about the ghost companies that siphoned patent income, they moved. It was business theater. Forged board minutes, faked signatures, a series of transfers that, when stitched together, painted Sam as the embezzler. The family manufactured a scandal. They made his friends turn their backs with quiet, efficient lies. Sam was arrested. They took the patents, the credit, and the roof from over his head. They took his dignity like someone taking a clock apart to see whether the hour could be reset. The letter didn't spare me the smallest cruelty. Augustus admitted he had known some of it at the time. He had seen memos. He had watched a transfer authorized with a signature that no longer matched Sam's handwriting. He called himself a coward for not stopping it. Or, worse, for bargaining quietly in a room where men with more leverage insisted on compromises that later looked like inevitability. He wrote that remorse had hollowed him out for decades. He was not absolving himself so much as offering a ledger he had kept. 30 years of receipts, wire transfers, bank accounts, phony invoices, lawyers' notes, names of shell corporations, and copies of documents the family had used to bury Sam. He called it armor because people in suits understood armor. He wanted me to have something that would not bend under threats. My chest felt like it had been hollowed and then packed with ice when I found out how personal the ledger was. Augustus described entries where he had tried to keep Sam afloat in secret, sending small payments that were always misdirected, intended to be hidden under the rubble. He admitted he'd given the family cover in board votes because a lean man on a charity case would look like sentimental charity, and that, in time, made the lie easier to maintain. He talked about watching Sam's life collapse and telling himself it was an unfortunate cost of doing this. The letter named people I vaguely remembered from old photos on my mother's mantle. Men whose faces had seemed like monuments in my childhood, and traced their complicity in clean, clinical ink. Then the key came up again. Augustus had written that the ledger was not in the envelope for safety's sake. It was hidden in his study, behind a false panel in a drawer where he kept correspondence he didn't want others to find. The brass key in my hand fit a very small lock in the base of a cedar box, the kind of box you keep something you want to feel heavy in your palm. He warned that the ledger was both an instrument and a danger. Enough to ruin them if used correctly, enough to ruin me if I used it recklessly. He asked for one thing outright, not revenge, exactly, but justice, which he defined in the letter as the truth being visible and accountable. He wrote with a dry kind of tenderness that he wanted Sam's name to be placed back into the history he'd been stripped from. Reading those pages, the years of my father's slow erasure came back in half memories. The way he stopped answering the phone after a certain call, the frozen look on his face when relatives came to help, the smell of bleach on the shirts he never seemed to wear with the same ease. He died not rich, not entirely loved, with a stain that others had called scandal, where I had only ever felt a bruise. For decades, I had carried a private, pulsing question: whether the man who taught me to take apart lawnmowers and radios had been a criminal. Augustus's handwriting slammed that question with an answer that felt like both exoneration and accusation. When I found the safe the key fit, a thin, false-bottomed compartment in an antique desk in Augustus's study that smelled of cedar and pipe tobacco, the ledger was exactly what he had promised. It was leather-bound, heavy with paper that had the soft crackle of age, and its pages were dense with names, dates, and numbers so small they looked like a map of a secret city. There were copies of contracts with forged signatures, bank statements lining up with dinners and flights, and notes, sometimes Augustus's, sometimes others, that read like trail markers in a crime scene. Photographs, too. Headshots of men signing papers, a grainy image of Sam beside a factory prototype, a scanned letter that had been doctored to implicate him. I sat on the study floor, ledger open across my knees, and realized the very thing I had been given was a kind of responsibility that felt like authority and knives at once. Augustus had not just given me money. He'd handed me a map through a minefield. He used the word armor again in the margin, underlined until the ink tore the page. Armor against lies. Armor to defend a name. Armor to go on offense if necessary. The room seemed to hum with the weight of it. For a long time, I did nothing but press my fingertips against the leather, as if to read where the truth might be embossed. Then I looked up at the portrait of Augustus on the wall, and the man who'd sat through his own decline to stitch a ledger felt, for the first time since the will reading, less like a stranger and more like a conspirator in a plan that had finally reached me. My life had changed from a script I performed into a script I wrote. The ledger closed with a small, final snap, and I felt the sensation of taking on something that would not let me sleep the same way again. I didn't parade the ledger like a trophy. I carried it under my arm like a Bible, because that's what it had become, a collection of sins spelled out in ink. I arranged the meeting at a neutral conference room downtown because I wanted witnesses who couldn't be accused of bias. One table, glass walls, a coffee urn that didn't pretend to be decorative. Helena, Elliot, and Vivian arrived with their posture perfected into contempt. At their side was Roderick Voss, a man whose suits looked like they were cut from other people's reputations. He had the sort of smile that lubricates litigation. They expected performative humility, a bargaining that would begin with denials and end with signatures and tight-lipped forgiveness. They were prepared to litigate until my pockets ran dry and their patience ran out. They were not prepared for the ledger. I opened it. The pages are not cinematic. No dramatic envelopes or receipts falling in slow motion. They're bureaucratic, banal, and therefore lethal. Wire transfers with routing numbers. Bank statements that match the dates of vacations the family claimed to be philanthropic work. Word-for-word comparisons between a signature the company produced to justify a transfer and the handwriting samples I'd pulled from Sam's old notebooks. There were screenshots of emails with headers proving they came from executive accounts set up for shell entities. There were notes, Augustus's notes, about meetings where someone suggested, we file it away, and someone else suggested, we make him the scapegoat. There were copies of a shoddy affidavit used in Sam's prosecution, and beneath it, a cleaner, earlier draft that vindicated what Augustus said, forged. There were invoices for consulting work that never happened, invoices routed to accounts in cities where no offices existed. Roderick read them the way a man reads a menu, superficially interested, certain he'll order something harmless. I watched Helena's cheeks blanch in a way I had only ever seen in people who suddenly remembered a sin they'd planned on denying forever. Elliot's hands stopped their rehearsed fists. Vivian's perfume no longer announced her. It clung faintly like a regret. I didn't speak in theatrics. I pointed. Wire fraud, money laundering, forged corporate minutes, perjury. You have copies of citizen affidavits and a toxicology report that was manufactured to shore up a false story. Federal jurisdiction on the fraud claims is clean. Interstate wires, offshore accounts. You know that. Roderick knows that. So do you. Roderick's jaw worked. He made an attempt at a joke, something about colorful imagination, and then realized he had nothing that didn't sound like an attempt to gaslight a room full of jurors. I slid a thumb drive across the table. It contained imaged copies and metadata, timestamps, creation histories. This goes to the U.S. Attorney and the SEC, I said plainly. If you pursue this will contest, you'll force me to share it. You know what that means. There was a moment, thin as thread, when the room's air changed. The Langleys' entitlement had always been based on two things: anonymity and the assumption that consequences could be bought. The ledger destroyed both. You can't unring a bell when paper has your voice recorded on it. Roderick tried the old playbook. Threaten countersuits, accuse me of tampering, promise reputational damage. I had expected all the theater. Augustus had anticipated it. His careful notes called out the likely legal moves and the channels he'd use to preserve the evidence. He had included contact info for investigators he'd trusted, people who didn't take calls from the wealthy unless they had subpoenas in hand. I tapped the phone. They know to expect this, I said. They won't take anonymous tips. They'll want their own chain of custody. Make your next move in court, and you'll be making your next move under indictment. The concession came like a slow thaw. It wasn't melodramatic. There were no confessions on the table, no dramatic sobs. There were signatures on a legal document relinquishing their contest and authorizing an immediate transfer of control. There were withdrawals of motions and the sight of Roderick's tie loosening the way a man loosens a noose he's no longer willing to wear. The family left the room with the same graceless speed they had once moved to sign Sam out of the company records. Businesslike, cold, and practiced. In the days that followed, the Langleys retreated not with a defeat so public it would have satisfied a crowd, but with an evaporating presence. Their philanthropic foundations announced a hiatus for restructuring. Board seats were quietly vacated. A publicist who had built reputations for 5 families resigned with a short statement about personal reasons. The newspapers that had been feeding on the juicy provocation now found their headlines wilting. Without a contest to litigate, gossip editors had to look for new prey. 2 things surprised me. 1, how quickly the people who lived entirely in the public eye could dissolve into obscurity when the private machinery that had kept them afloat was threatened. 2, how little joy I felt. The Ledger had granted me a certain kind of victory, restoration of my name and the quiet possibility of clearing Sam. But the price was not sweet. It tasted like ash. I had taken from people who had taken from my father. I had used their own sins to lever a door open. Justice, if justice is the right word, looked less like a gavel and more like a small, steady closing of a chapter that had lasted decades. After the dust settled, there were no triumphant parades. There was a letter from Augustus's executor acknowledging his clear intent and the transfer of authority. There were meetings with regulators who were thorough and politely efficient, the kind that make a person feel simultaneously vindicated and exposed. And there, amid the paperwork and the whispered probes, I felt something I hadn't expected. An odd, steadying relief. Not because they'd gone away. People with that kind of power seldom vanish entirely, but because the Ledger was no longer an accusation. It was a fact in the world. Sam's name had a place again. Still, when I walked past the tall glass windows of Langley Enterprises the first time as an owner in public, people looked at me as if they were trying to decide whether I belonged to the same species. Power is funny that way. It recognizes itself immediately and glares at anything it deems an imposter. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The Ledger had done the gloating for me in neat, merciless ink. Taking control of Langley Enterprises felt less like stepping onto a throne and more like being handed a live grenade with instructions in a language I'd never learned. The executives expected a polite interregnum, press statements, token continuity, an interim CEO who would keep the lights on until the family resolved things. They didn't expect me, a night nurse with a ledger and a stubborn sense of fairness, to treat the company like a medical chart, diagnosing rot and prescribing immediate excision. Graham Cole, the interim CEO, had the sort of practiced composure that comes from decades of telling anxious shareholders that everything was fine. Theresa Boyd, the CFO, carried her years like a ledger itself, neat, exact, and liable to be subpoenaed. Caleb Ruiz, general counsel, smiled like a man who'd read more indemnity clauses than he had bedtime stories. They arrived at my first board meeting with speeches practiced and metrics polished. I arrived with evidence. I didn't stage a spectacle. I walked into the room with the ledger under my arm, and with a calm I had to manufacture out of exhaustion and the weird, steady adrenaline that comes when you realize something is finally possible. I laid pages out on the table, pointed to wire transfers that matched vacations, to invoices that paid shell entities, to signatures that matched Sam's handwriting in ways that made the forgery obvious to anyone who knew how a pen hesitated. I read one email aloud, a casual, corporate-sounding line that scheduled a remediation meeting the day after Sam was arrested, followed by a note about tightening narratives. Theresa's hand trembled when she reached for the pages as if she expected them to burn. Graham's practiced smile slipped into a tight line. Caleb began to sputter legalese about chain of custody and claims and the naughty little world of discovery. He tried the old deflection. These are old administrative matters. I cut him off. Administrative matters that cost my father his life, I said. Administrative matters that will cost people their freedom if we don't do this right. I didn't fire anyone on impulse. Power wielded without precision is cowardice. Instead, I ordered independent forensic audits, froze accounts tied to the suspicious transfers, and placed a temporary hold on any executive bonuses until the audit concluded. I hired a special counsel outside the usual orbit so there could be no whisper that I had looked the other way. The ledger wasn't a cudgel. It was a protocol. I wanted the company intact. I wanted employees protected. And I wanted those who had abused the company held accountable. There were gasps, the kind that come when the machinery of comfortable corruption is nudged by truth. And then there were the muted, practical responses of people whose livelihoods depended on stability. It was during that period of cleaning and cauterizing that Elliot Langley called. He didn't call from a gilded suite. He called from a number I didn't recognize, voice compressed with a kind of urgent shame. Evelyn, he said, and the name came out as if testing for forgiveness. We need to talk. Now. He showed up at my apartment that night with a paper bag and a face that had learned to look contrite in boardrooms, but didn't know how to do it in narrow hallways. He admitted, almost before I could close the door, that Helena was planning something desperate, a forged will, a fabricated affidavit, and a toxicology report that would attempt to paint my presence at Augustus's bedside as culpable, the narrative they'd been constructing all along, turned lethal. They planned to accuse me of hastening his death, to make me into the villain that covered their tracks. I can't let her do it, Elliot said. His hands were small, nervous. If she forges things, if she accuses you of murder, she'll bury more than the will. She'll bury the ledger. She'll bury Sam forever. She wants to make a cleansing thing of it. Then the bargain. He wanted immunity. He wanted me to promise I would use the ledger to exonerate his mother publicly. Let's stop the criminal referrals, pull back the federal notices, quiet the auditors. In exchange, he would testify that Helena had coerced him, that he had been a puppet, that he would come forward about the forgeries and the toxicity of the report, and weave a story that could keep his own hands clean. He offered me his testimony as currency and asked me to cash it for his freedom. The offer landed like a warm, dangerous coin on my kitchen table. I can be practical. I can be strategic. I can imagine the relief of a quick, clean legal end. But I had Sam's face in my head. The nights he stayed awake fixing whatever appliances he could to keep things together when we had less than enough. I had the ledger across my lap, a thing built with the deliberate care of a man making sure the truth could survive after he'd left. Accepting Elliot's deal would be a kind of shorthand for peace. Quick headlines, a controlled narrative, an end to the harassment. It would also be a way of letting someone who had been complicit walk away. No, I said. Saying it felt like pulling another thread loose in an old sweater. I won't make a deal that lets you or your mother off the hook. He tried to bargain harder. He revealed details, who Helena had talked to about the forged toxicology, an echoing voicemail he'd intercepted, a clinic they planned to use. He named names of forgers and forensics labs they thought were discreet. He told me he could testify, that he wanted to testify, but he couldn't do it if I insisted on full accountability. He wanted to be spared. I told him what every ledger had already told me. Names attached to actions don't age into stories of they were young or they were pressured. They become records. Justice isn't spite disguised as cruelty. It's the mechanism by which a man like Sam gets his name back. Letting Elliot off for a confession would mean the ledger's teeth were dulled. It would mean I had traded long-term truth for short-term comfort. It would mean Sam's exoneration came with caveats, with holes, with a neat little forgiveness that cost the living theirs. He left furious and terrified, and beneath it all, relieved that he'd tried. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the city lights blink like an audience that couldn't look away. There were nights I pictured myself tempted to take the deal, to hand him a pardon in exchange for the drama of his testimony. Those were the nights I realized I wasn't in this for vindication that tasted like coffee and convenience. I was in it for a ledger that would not be negotiated into invisibility. When he left, he said one last thing that lodged itself in my teeth. "If they try to accuse you, they'll make it ugly." I nodded. I already knew that. I already knew how ugly people could make truth look when they were running for their lives. The ledger shivered in the corner like a sleeping thing. I didn't sleep much that week, but I slept with resolve. I wouldn't bargain away accountability, and if Helena or anyone tried to forge a path to bury the truth with me, they would find that the ledger had teeth sharper than their forgeries. They came at me like a thunderclap wrapped in silk. The morning of the emergency hearing, the courthouse smelled like disinfectant and old leather chairs. Television vans crouched outside like predators. Helena walked in with Roderick at her elbow, and they carried the sort of calm that had always been their most useful weapon. Smiles prepped, papers pristine, outrage on cue. Roderick unfurled their arsenal with the economy of a man who'd practiced this motion. A supposedly more recent will that left everything back to the family. A notarized affidavit from a concerned nurse whose signature would later be proven copied, and a toxicology report from a lab that, on the face of it, looked technical enough to terrify any judge who didn't like surprises. They wanted the judge to reassign control, to freeze my authority, to paint the ledger and my inheritance as the product of an opportunistic nurse who'd crossed a line. They wanted headlines and a court order that would bury the ledger's teeth under procedural paper. They wanted me to be silenced and then erased. Roderick presented the forged will as if laying down a trump card. He pushed the affidavit forward with a satisfied tilt of his chin and described the toxicology with the cool contempt of someone for whom science is a costume. It was a tidy, awful little narrative. Motive, opportunity, a nurse who spent the last hours within reach of a dying man. Mr. Calder rose when it was his turn to respond. He moved differently than the theatrics Roderick preferred. He was not showy. He was the steady sort who makes impossible things look like arithmetic. He asked for permission to call one witness. The judge, browed and practical, allowed it. I had expected argument. I had not expected the stick that would undo the whole contrived tapestry. The courtroom doors swung open, and accompanied by 2 U.S. Marshals, Elliot Langley was brought in. Handcuffs glinted under the court lights. He did not look like the polished son who'd once paced a funeral home with rehearsed grief. He looked hollowed, human in the way people do when choice finally catches them in a corner. There was a quiet so complete that even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Roderick's smile thinned to a line. Helena's eyes found me like a searching thing. I steadied my face because the ledger had taught me how to hold paper stills, how to be factual when the world wanted melodrama. Elliot's testimony was not the smooth, cleaned-up confession Roderick had hoped for. The marshals had arrested him on an array of charges: conspiracy to create fraudulent documents, obstruction, and critically, wire fraud, tied to payments traced to labs and expert witnesses who did not exist. Mr. Calder had coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office, who had their own reasons for moving quickly. When you follow where the money went, you find accounts that don't like being anonymous. On the stand, Elliot didn't speak in boardroom euphemism. He talked about panic rooms and whispered phone calls, about his mother's insistence on fixing the narrative before the public could decide which version of their family to believe. He described a late-night meeting with a forensic consultant who was nothing more than a name and a routing number. He read aloud a string of messages, texts, emails, voicemails, that Mr. Calder had already authenticated. His mother's requests, his lawyer's guidance on staging evidence, an intercepted voicemail where he could be heard promising payment for a toxicology report that would make the timeline neat. That last bit hit the judge with the force of a dropped plank. The toxicology that Roderick presented had no legitimate chain of custody. The lab's supposed director could not be reached at the number provided. The metadata on the report showed it had been created and last modified on a laptop registered to an account in a shell company owned by a front they'd tried to use to launder the payment. The affidavit bore a signature that, when examined, matched another document in the ledger's collection. Copied, pasted, and aged with the kind of clumsy attention that forensic document examiners sniff out like smoke. Elliot's confession was messy, and in its messiness, it was credible. He admitted to facilitating calls, to helping set up a meeting with someone who would make problems disappear, and to providing bank routing information. He swore, under oath, that his mother had pushed the plan harder than anyone else, because the narrative of a nurse who took advantage of a dying man would cover a multitude of sins, including whatever skeletons remained stuffed in the family coffers. Roderick tried to gaslight the testimony. He objected to everything he could think of, flailed for procedural errors, and attempted to paint Elliot as a man induced to lie by federal pressure. Mr. Calder answered with documents and timestamps and a voicemail that had its own little ring of mortality, Elliot's voice offering money in exchange for help. The judge listened, and the judge read forward-looking law that was not impressed by well-pressed etiquette. By the time the prosecution's exhibits were accepted into evidence, the forged will had gone from a plausible trump card to a smudged forgery. The affidavit's credibility evaporated. The toxicology report was declared tainted beyond salvage. The judge did not lecture. He did what good judges do when confronted with clear procedural corruption. He denied the emergency requests for reassignment and ordered the U.S. attorney to expedite an investigation into the documents and the threads that led to them. He admonished counsels for flinging accusations without chain of custody proof and set a schedule for discovery that placed the family's paper trail squarely under federal microscopes. When Elliot finished testifying, he did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had spent a lifetime wearing someone else's armor and finally felt it clank to the floor. He spoke in a smaller voice of guilt and shame and a desire to do what was right finally. Not because I was the person he had wronged, but because the ledger demanded truth no matter how ugly it made family names look in print. Outside the courtroom, the world that had wanted a scandal found one, but not the one they expected. Reporters reached for headlines, as always, but the narrative was no longer a neat, sellable villain. What the ledger revealed, and what Elliot's testimony confirmed, was a messy, institutional rot. That was worse for some and better for others. For me, it was exoneration shaped by a slow, cold logic rather than the sudden catharsis of vengeance. I walked out under the courthouse portico with Mr. Calder at my side and the ledger in a locked briefcase carried by an agent who refused my thanks. People shouted questions. A camera found my face and held it like a lens looking for cracks. I felt the ledger's weight at my hip like a second heartbeat. I did not feel victorious in the way television shows make you feel victorious. I felt very tired and very unmoored, and strangely, very close to something like peace. The moral of it, if you wanted one, was not a neat moral at all. The ledger didn't make people repent. It made their choices visible. It made their phone calls and invoices and forged signatures speak plainly. And when a life has been erased by other people's cunning, sometimes justice is not fireworks and confessions. Sometimes it is the judicial system being boringly, finally rigorous. The sort of thing that reads like a footnote but acts like an anchor. Elliot was taken back into custody, pending his cooperation with prosecutors. Helena and Roderick had to answer for what they had presented to the court. Their legal thunderclaps had been exposed as weather they had manufactured. I left the courthouse with my name intact, my hands less trembling than they had been at the start, and the ledger humming in my head like a machine that had finally been wound tight. I was not naive enough to think that the end of a hearing would end everything. Power reshapes itself. People who once believed themselves untouchable learn to be smaller. But for the first time since my father's life began to be erased, the facts had air enough to breathe. That, in itself, felt like a kind of mercy.